Hi, everyone, and welcome to a Dart Drones webinar on how water authorities are unleashing versatility, safety, and efficiency with drones. So before we begin, I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's webinar. So due to that, please go ahead and mute yourself just to eliminate any background noise throughout this session. The mute button can be found on the upper left-hand corner of your control panel. I also wanted to mention that after today's webinar, you'll all be emailed a link to the recorded live session as well as today's slide deck. So to give everyone a quick rundown, today we'll be covering the use cases, benefits, studies, ROI, as well as Albany Water's experience with drone training and program development. We'll also be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so if any questions come up, please feel free to just submit them in the chat section on your screen, and then we'll answer as many as we can during that Q&A session. All right, so today's speakers are Colin Romberger and Brian Hunter. Colin is both a private pilot and advanced ground instructor and holds a master's degree in UAS design and operations from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He holds multiple FAA airman certificates for manned aircraft operations, and he currently owns and operates a drone services company in Pennsylvania with a focus on mapping and inspections. And then Brian is the chief of security for Albany, New York Water Department. And then previously, he was a park ranger with the National Park Service, a wildland firefighter, paramedic, and whitewater river guide. Brian also holds a Bachelor of Science in Emergency Medical Care and Business Management. So with that said, I'm going to actually go ahead and pass things over to Colin, and then we'll jump into it.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Appreciate it. Yeah, a pleasure to have everyone with us again today. So before we go ahead and kick things off with Brian and learn more about what Albany's been doing with their program over the last 6 to 12 months at this point, just wanted to give a little introduction as far as who we are here at Dart Drones. So to date, I'm sure most of you know us as an authority in training and education and consultation when it comes to unmanned aircraft services and programs in different capacities with our clients here throughout the United States. To date, we have trained over 8,000 individuals to either operate the systems directly or to pass their FAA tests to get their required certifications, or really just consulting with companies and individuals to help make their efforts with unmanned aircraft a bit more successful. Because in the early days, as I'm sure some of you know, it can be somewhat of a challenge to go from getting that nice new certificate from the FAA to actually being able to get out there and prove the value and worth of these systems and start collecting quality data and quality imagery that we can use for different purposes. We've been fortunate over the last about 4 years now to have worked with a lot of different agencies, both public and private, and really help them hit the ground running with an unmanned aircraft program and get all of the documentation, all of the authorizations, waivers, et cetera, that they need to be successful with their operations, as well as get all of their operators fully up to speed, trained, certificated, and again, ready to be successful out in the field. Right now, our training services, they extend everything from basic flight training and that Part 107 certification prep training that I mentioned, all the way up into very specified verticals related to different applications in terms of aerial mapping and modeling, different forms of SUAS inspection tactics, broadcast media, public safety applications, really, you name it, we've worked with those folks in those various industries to help them be successful in this space and this rapidly growing field that is small unmanned aircraft systems. That being said, before we hear from Brian and talk about some of the successes that they've had with their program, I'd like to talk about some of the more recent news that has really led to a lot more organizations and a lot more agencies beginning to adopt unmanned aircraft systems for their various uses. First off, back, and I'm going to kind of go through this in reverse order, but back in 2018, last year, the FAA did complete the initial rollout for what's called the Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability Framework or system, which really was a big difference and a game changer in how we were able to get authorizations to fly unmanned aircraft in a lot of areas where it was harder to do that previously. As those of you that know, when we're operating under the Part 107 regulations that the FAA has for us, we need different authorizations to fly in areas of controlled airspace. And before the land system, it was very difficult and very time-consuming process to get those individual authorizations for all the different areas that we may need to operate in. Lance has proven to be a great solution in many areas where now all of those authorizations can be obtained via a instant authorization system directly through different online or different app-based methods. So that's been great for many of us who were burdened with that and located close to some of our larger airport facilities with air traffic control towers. Also, more recent news that we've that's been very encouraging. First off, the FAA did recently issue the first, we'll say, blanket waiver to allow for beyond visual line of sight operations, and that was issued to an insurance company who was using aircraft to basically map large areas for large-scale damage following natural disasters and hurricanes and things. The FAA previously to issuing this one, every beyond visual line of sight waiver that had been granted was very area specific. It was basically, if you wanted to fly beyond visual line of sight, you could only do it in a particular designated area that you specified in your requests. Now the FAA has started to issue waivers that allow for the use of these systems or certain systems in beyond visual line of sight capabilities in virtually any area of Class G uncontrolled airspace. So again, there's only been one issued, and it was part of the Department of Transportation's pilot program with unmanned aircraft systems, but it does illustrate that the FAA is learning more about the safety issues with unmanned aircraft in a real world context, and they are recognizing that a lot of these more complex operations can be executed safely and successfully. Finally, we've gotten a lot of very good news recently in that the FAA has put out a notice of proposed rulemaking to also make night operations with unmanned aircraft, as well as certain flights over non-participants, so flights over members of the public, readily available and possible using standard Part 107 regulations. So no longer in need of waivers for those two operational types once these new rules are passed. Initially, we thought that was going to take a little while. We weren't really anticipating those to roll out until the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. But the FAA did recently announce that they only intend to leave the comment period open for these new regulations until mid-April of this year. And then, that basically means that by, mid to late summer, early fall, now we could actually see those new rules coming into effect, which really is going to give a lot of more operating capabilities to a lot of different agencies, and also to some of the different applications that water authorities have when it comes to utilizing these systems in your various parts of the country. So we're here to talk about what the city of Albany has been doing with their unmanned aircraft program since they got started a little while ago. And I've been fortunate enough that I've had the pleasure of working with Brian and the rest of his team since the beginning when they first started looking at this program. I've also had a chance to work with other water authorities around the country. And like many industries, it's amazing how our different use cases, specific use cases and specific challenges challenges and successes with unmanned aircraft will vary based on where we are in the country and what that means as far as, the environments that we have to operate in, and how our jobs are going to differ. Even though we're talking about water authorities, water authorities in California, a lot different, we'll say, than water authorities in the Northeast, at least in some of my experience recently. So, Brian, great to have you with us today. We're going to talk about some of the various use cases that are out there. So from working with you, I know that security was a big concern initially when you guys were first coming to us and looking to get this program up and going, but also had to do with questions about, can we use this for different project planning purposes and management purposes when it comes to aerial mapping? Can we use this with regard to our water quality and getting information about that? What about our critical infrastructure and inspecting, our reservoirs, inspecting our dams, some of our other infrastructure facilities that you have within the area. So before we get into your use cases, why don't you tell us a little bit about, what got you thinking about unmanned aircraft and what got you guys going in the process?
Well, the process started a little over a year ago, starting to research ways that we could utilize drones in all aspects of the water department operations, initially focusing on security because we do have extensive watershed land and finished reservoirs and whatnot. And we were looking for ways to supplement security patrols, but quickly learned that we could use the drones in many ways throughout the department.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, in my time with you, I had the opportunity to go out in the field and see some of those areas that and some of the project that you guys were working on, and really very interesting stuff. So why don't you go ahead and lead us in? We'll talk a little bit about project planning and where you've had your successes in that area right now.
Yeah, sure. As we started to learn more about the capabilities, we realized that we needed to identify 3 different work groups within the department: engineering, security, and watershed management, because each of those work groups could really take advantage of it. And so far, we've gotten the most work accomplished through the engineering department, just because we've had some pretty extensive construction projects going on. For instance, this Tivoli Park project, it's basically daylighting a stream that has been piped and underground for about 80 years, and we're turning it into a nice green space that's within the city. And this project, the construction project in total, is going to be taking about a year. We're about a third of the way through it, and we're using the drones to track the progress and make sure that our contractor are making their deadlines and checking off all the boxes that they're required to do. And it makes those inspections so much easier and efficient. We're able to use drone deploy to duplicate the flight pattern every time, and that way we can stack the images together and track the progress side by side.
That's great. I know they're doing the same thing in a lot of areas when it comes to construction, and making sure that those contractors are staying up to task on what's being done. Have you noticed? Have you been able to catch small problems before they've become big problems at this point in doing that, Brian?
No, actually, fortunately, this contractor that we've had a long relationship with them, so they know what we expect of them. But it's still a good way to document too for public relations purposes. We've been able to utilize Twitter and Facebook to show the progress of the project. So the one thing that was interesting, we had a flash flood that came through a couple months ago, and a portable generator and some supplies got washed away in the flood, and we were able actually to use the drone to track down those pieces of equipment and supplies.
That's great. And were they still salvageable after they gotten washed away, Brian?
Well, the generator needed to be refurbished, but yeah,
sure,
we were able to save most of it.
That's great. Fantastic. And what about we always talk about how drones can really serve as a force multiplier. We get up there and now we're able to capture imagery and in turn data of such wide areas. Where have you seen the benefits in time savings in some of your projects within the various departments recently?
Yeah, most extensively in our raw watershed, which is what you see there. That's the Alcove Reservoir. And we need to do regular inspections of tributaries to monitor for blockages, whether it be beaver dams or encroachments from neighboring landowners. And the ability that the drone gives us to get up and look over a wide area and do inspections in 10 to 20 minutes that on foot would take hours potentially. Just again saves a lot of time, and then when you're reducing the amount of time that people are out in the field like that, obviously it reduces any kind of injuries, workplace injuries.
Absolutely, yes. Safety is a big thing, and a lot of times, that brings another point. I know that at least at this point, you and the rest of the team haven't had a lot of use yet with the aircraft from a structural inspection standpoint. But some of the water authorities, I'm sure, that are on with us today, if they're responsible for tank inspections and other types of critical infrastructure inspection, along those lines, being able to get up there in some of those dangerous areas instead of climbing or sending a person up there to climb around and look at different things. If we can document conditions with the aircraft and still keep the human operator's feet firmly on the ground, improve safety and also, as you mentioned, can really improve some of the time involved in these processes as well.
Yeah, we have done a decent amount of structure inspections of our water towers.
Right.
And money savings as well as you mentioned, safety. And then not related to the water department, but the building and codes department got wind that we had these drones. And as we've had time, we've been assisting them with rooftop and backyard inspections of buildings that are either condemned or in the process of being condemned. And we've saved them enormous amount of time, because in the past they would have to get the fire department out to block the street and get the ladder truck up. And
sure.
One day we did rooftop inspection of 25 buildings in about 2 hours.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. That's great. And interagency cooperation there, or interdepartment cooperation, that's always a great thing to see happening too. That's fantastic. Excellent. As far as the security applications, this was really what you and I first started talking about. I think the very first time that I came up to visit with you guys, and that was probably coming up on a year ago at this point. And why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the specific challenges that you've had when it comes to security?
Yeah, well, the image that is on the screen now is our finished reservoir, which is in just outside the city up on the hill, and it has a fenced perimeter, and there's a neighborhood that surrounds the reservoir. So there are obviously security concerns with people being able to access that, especially in the winter. I've found that we've been able to use the drones to patrol that perimeter rather than getting the guards out in unsafe conditions when there's a lot of snow on the ground, and just conduct that perimeter inspection again in just a fraction of the amount of time that it would take a human on the ground doing it. And then additionally, at our raw reservoir, we have approximately 6,000 acres of watershed land that we own, and we've been beginning to conduct patrols with the drones to identify areas where people trespass in. It is not fenced in. It would be prohibitive to do that. So we, in the past, have had to rely on spotty foot patrols and vehicle patrols, but with the drones, I've been able to identify well-worn trails, and then with that knowledge, go and then target those areas with operations to attempt to catch people trespassing. And we did catch one person in the fall, a bow hunter that was illegally hunting on their property.
Oh wow! And did they recognize the drone in the air when you were looking at them before
No,
someone
we
actually
didn't
put it
actually
together?
catch them with the drone. We had
Okay.
identified their trail with the drone prior to, and then had people waiting for them when we thought they might be going in.
Oh, excellent, excellent. That's great. That's great. Now, I'm curious, I'm looking at your picture here and I see the communications tower, or one of the towers that's there. Any issues that you've had with your aircraft flying around any of the tower structures, cell phone towers, anything like that that you may have on any of the properties?
Do you mean interference or
Yeah,
actually?
yeah. Well, yeah, interference initially, but or if you've done anything as far as inspection too.
Not of that specific tower. That's owned by a cell company. They just lease that property from
Sure,
us.
sure.
But to the bottom right of that screen, I think on the next slide, you'll see one of our water towers that we have conducted inspections on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's take a look as we're going to move into talking about where you've seen your return on investment. So yeah, that's a great view right there. And so you said you've done some work around that one, and the tower next door doesn't give you any issues. Systems are pretty stable at this point for you.
Yeah, I haven't noticed any problems. The only issue when you first start up the drone, you definitely want to make sure you're away from any kind of, big metal objects for the
Right.
calibration. But I've not had any experience with interference from an actual flight.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing, how much more robust they're getting. A few years ago, even just a couple of years ago, some of the previous models that were out that we were using fairly extensively, they could be the data link connectivity, could be heavily impacted, very, very quickly sometimes. There's different compass modules in there with the metal sources that you're talking about. I was actually out doing some work with some folks doing tank inspections a few weeks ago, and we just simulated an emergency where we had to put the drone down on top of the tank, and when we landed on top of the tank, we got the message on the screen about the issue with the compass and the magnetometer. But as soon as we retook off and got some clearance, it instantly went back, was able to correct for that, and went back to stable operations. So really impressive how that's happening. So but yeah, I just was curious. I saw your photos there, so wanted to bring that up. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about where you've seen some of this return on investment, and it looks like you've seen some with those tower inspections. Why don't you tell us about that, Brian?
Yeah, definitely. As you can see there, in the past, when they have conducted tower inspections, the rental of the snorkel lift is $750, and then two inspectors at $100 an hour. Speaking with our structural engineer, she said that in the past those inspections easily cost $1,500 per tower, which we have four of, and really should be doing them at least once a quarter. So that's significant savings there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what about the time? You're talking about time, that we're dealing with. It's saying now approximately 30 minutes, basically, correct?
Yeah, and that's very conservative too. That's probably the time that we showed up there prior to getting the drone in the air, and right up until the time we left. So flight time was probably more like 15 or 20 minutes. She was standing over my shoulder telling me what photos to capture for her,
Hmm.
and like it says there, 30 minutes, whereas the traditional inspection would take multiple hours.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's great. The spot inspections and having your engineers there to direct you where you're going. I know a lot of other folks have had success with different tower inspections. Basically collecting comprehensive imagery sets. They might fly around and get running video. They might capture a series of photographs overlapping that they can either use with photogrammetry and combine that with LiDAR if they really are looking at different structural issues. Lots of different things that we can do with it. I know you've done some work with drone deploy as far as some of your mapping projects for your different land projects that you've got going on. Any tinkering around yet with modeling of any of the structures as far as when you're documenting the towers and things?
No, we haven't used drone deploy yet with the towers. It's just been manual flight
Sure.
and photo capturing. Really, where we've been using drone deploy is on those construction projects.
Yeah.
so we can get a consistent flight path and get the same images over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, I know, there can be some challenges with, the more complex structures when it comes to, just straight photogrammetry. If we want to, look at that from an inspection standpoint, a lot of times we do have to combine that with LiDAR information, or use, very, very, high megapixel large sensor cameras to do very detailed structural modeling. But, creating the model itself, that the benefit there can sometimes give us an index for those individual images. So we can take all the images, stack them all together with their overlaps and things, generate the model, and then when we want to, click in and see, the actual condition of certain components, we can click on that model and we can pull up, a series of the individual photographs that were captured there, and it helps, make the process a little bit easier if you don't have the benefit of having your engineer out there at the time. But the fact that they're able to go out there with you and just save that amount of time is really definitely a big deal, I'm sure. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but you're not necessarily doing this with your most expensive systems, correct? Are you doing this with some of the smaller systems you've acquired as well?
Yeah, we've actually used the Mavic 2 Zoom primarily.
Yep.
We have also a matrice, which the watershed management work group is primarily going to be using with that slant range sensor for forest health and monitoring for algal blooms and different kinds of vegetation growing in the reservoir.
Yeah, and it'll be curious. Yeah, I'm anxious to see how that works for them. Once the weather warms up and we see, some of that, some of those, the life coming back. We'll say to the foliage and those different regions. That's fantastic. Let's talk.
One more
go
thing,
ahead.
Colin, real quick.
Sure,
They're also
no
going
problem.
for exploring getting a different sensor for that matrice to do a deer count, because we're in the beginning processes of working with DEC to do a deer harvesting program, because the deer are really laying waste our forest land. So first we need to get a handle on how many deer there are and where they are, and then develop the plan for the harvesting program from there.
Yep, absolutely. And I've seen some great things, with that AI integrated into, the photogrammetric process, after those orthomosaics are generated, being able to, really pick out, virtually anything that we can, provide it with as far as an initial identification. It's getting very, very good, depending on their software you're using and pulling that out. So, yeah, I'm sure you'll have some good success with that. I've seen a lot of very impressive things in a very short period of time. So that's fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about training and what your operators and things went through. Obviously, we were working with you guys from the very beginning, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what were your concerns getting all of your individual folks ready to start flying these systems? How did you want to approach the process of training?
Well, we first needed to identify who were going to be the initial pilots to be trained, and then select somebody that is well known and has a good reputation to conduct that training for us. And just in a couple of weeks of research that I did, you guys really stood out. We contacted you initially to do a consultation to determine our needs and what steps to take forward. And then based upon that, we issued an RFP, a request for proposal. There were about 7 companies that applied, that submitted RFPs, but again, you guys stood out as the clear company to use. And from there, we set up the initial basic flight training and the Part 107 training, which was 2 days. And after that, all 6 of us passed the FAA Part 107 test, all with very high scores. Your online training tools were very helpful in that. And then you consulted us on what equipment to purchase and pointed us in the direction of a good vendor for that. And once we obtained our equipment, we brought you back for another 3 days of advanced training with our equipment and in scenarios where we were going to be using them. And I have to say, it was seamless and very informative and professional. And yeah, that's it.
No, that's great, Brian. We definitely appreciate it. I know, and I think you're being somewhat generous to us. So when you say seamless, there, I recall when we came back. Obviously, we had just had a brand new shipment of brand new equipment that come in, and sometimes with a whole box of brand new equipment, we had our little small challenges as we were getting everything up and going there, but we ultimately got it all together and got you guys out there and let the rubber meet the road. So it's been a pleasure working with you guys and the whole team that's there, and hearing about your successes and what you've been able to accomplish so far, what you're looking at as far as the future, since you're already seeing those benefits. That's really the best part. We talk a lot about obviously, and you saw the value in hands-on training with the aircraft early on in this process, with that basic flight training, kind of going hand in hand with the Part 107 certification prep, and really, we want to do that with really everyone we work with, because we know that some of the we'll say anomalies that may crop up from time to time, even with the advanced aircraft systems we're dealing with. If we don't know how to deal with those little small anomalies, obviously they have that potential to progress into something much bigger, and something that could lead to an expensive and costly accident. But we also talk about continuing learning and ongoing education. One of the things that we recently got involved with as a flight school is AUVSI's Trusted Operator program, the TOP program, and it's really structured to give a solid foundation for operators in terms of safety, and then also have them establish that continual learning mentality. What have your folks been doing, Brian, when it comes to just flying? Are you encouraging them to go out and fly and keep making sure that they're building time, even if it is just practicing, not working in the field right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all of us have gotten significant flight time. Pete, the stormwater coordinator, has probably gotten the most because he's been doing those construction inspections. But Amy and Catherine have done a lot of the tributary inspections, and then Paul, our GIS guy, has been working on getting familiar with them. He started late on the certification process just because he had a lot of other stuff going on.
Sure.
But he's getting up to speed quickly. And we've also been, I would say, kind of testing the drones to see what they can perform in. I mean, we've gone out in some fairly windy weather and even some light rain and very cold, and haven't had any issues.
Yeah, I really have been impressed with the latest round of systems that have been coming out from DJI for about the last 2 years, I guess, at this point. Yes, we always watch for the regulatory considerations when it comes to visibility and cloud clearances when it does start to rain. But the manufacturer, I'm not going to say go out there and fly your aircraft in the rain, because obviously the manufacturer is telling you not to do that in terms of their warranties and things. But the real world is the real world, and sometimes we've got some priorities, and if we have a system that we can try and utilize, we're going to do that, as long as we can go through our assessments and help to best ensure safety. And I've been very impressed in terms of the capabilities, as you mentioned, wet or dry, and a lot of very, very strong wind conditions now, even with the new Mavic 2 series that you've seen with that. Very impressive systems that we're seeing, and that's not directly just for DJI. Obviously, that's really being seen across a wider just industry level, as we see the technology continue to progress as a whole. So really encouraging stuff. Brian, anything else that you wanted to share with everyone before we open up the floor for questions, and we'll ask Alicia if anyone submitted anything for us?
No, just if you do get a drone program going, be ready for other agencies within the city to knocking on your door to use it. We've had a lot of interest from the fire department, and we helped the police department is getting their own drone program, but we gave them a little bit of advice about things that we had learned. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of, it is, I understand, it's a good thing. But obviously, sometimes can start to put a strain on those resources too. So that's great. Appreciate it, Brian. So Alicia, have we had any questions that came in for Brian or myself?
Great, thank you, Colin and Brian. So we actually haven't received any questions for the Q&A session. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, I will be sending out the recording of the live session as well as the complete slide deck. So if any questions do come in during that time, please feel free to reach out to us. However, one question did just come in. So someone said, what are some of the biggest pain points to get past to start a program for a water authority?
Sure. Brian, go ahead.
Well, it's not inexpensive. Our total investment between training and equipment was approximately $58,000. Convincing your council members or different people that is a would be money well spent was initially difficult, but then once we really showed them what we were up to, and after our initial consultation with Dart Drones, and we were able to show them the work that they had done for us in that consultation, they were convinced. But I would say that's, the convincing other people that are skeptical about it is probably the biggest pain point.
Yeah, and I would say you're not alone in that, Brian. We hear that a lot, especially when you're working as a government agency, getting that funding and justifying that funding is a big hurdle. That's why we're always happy to meet with folks, prepare those reports that we can help illustrate the timeline and the pathway that you're going to be able to take and where you're going to be able to see those benefits. And glad to hear that was able to work out for you. Also, what a lot of other agencies sometimes tell us is, and this is more on the public safety side with, your law enforcement and fire departments and things like that, but getting the public buy-in as well, and being able to show them how this is going to improve, their experience with the local government, and not just be some, another tool that they can use to, gather information on them. That can also be a hassle, but, absolutely funding a big concern. So yeah, I appreciate that. Anything else, Alicia?
Yeah, Brian, this one is another question for you. Someone asked, do you recommend a phased approach to get started or start by planning out the whole program in the beginning?
Well, we are doing a phased approach because initially we trained 6 people, and our intent is in the next 2 years to get 6 more trained and obtain more drones. We're going to be working with Dart Drones on that additional training, and also more advanced training as we plan on in the spring bringing them back to do some more training with the slant range and things out on the watershed. So I would say you would want to have a good idea of what your end goal is going to be, but realize that you're going to have to do it in phases, because you will learn so much initially that you'll realize that there are uses for the drone that you didn't even anticipate.
Yeah, and I think that's very well put, Brian. Everyone, it's amazing how just based on, the very specific nature of the area that you serve and the areas that you have to fly, can really create some huge variables from one agency to the next. And, even though we've worked with a lot of folks and we've seen a lot of things, there is no, I would say there really is rarely, one best way to do something in any given area when it comes to to, how we utilize these systems right now. So, we usually advocate this phased approach, and it's been appropriate because of also, what we've seen changing with regulations. So, we really always encourage folks to get started with, what we call a test crew per se, where they can develop their initial standard operating procedures. They can get those initial folks trained and ready to go, and then they can get out in the field and start working on, some of that proof of concept and developing those long-term workflows to lay the foundation and then scale from there. I know it's been beneficial for a lot of folks, and I know been beneficial so far for you guys as well. That's great. Alicia, anything else?
Yeah, so another question for Brian. What are the minimum equipment requirements that you would recommend for a water authority? And does another water authority need FLIR?
I would say the minimum requirements are going to depend on the size of your water authority, but I would, at the very minimum, recommend 2 of the Mavic 2s or the like, and then depending on what your goals are and what you want to achieve with the drones, I would seriously consider getting one of the more advanced drones like the Matrice 210. And what was the second part of that question?
Would you recommend using?
Yeah, asking about FLIR and thermal imaging, Brian.
Yeah, we're right now we're exploring obtaining a FLIR sensor for that deer count, and then thermal could also come in handy if you have if the occasion or the need to ever do search and rescue operations on your watershed property.
Yeah, we've seen some some interesting uses with FLIR in water authorities outside of our working with Brian and the city of Albany. We've seen it being used to detect leaks in certain areas because obviously when water starts to leak out of things, might not be initially visible, but the temperature differences can usually show up pretty clearly on those thermal cameras. So that's one area to look at. So it really, I think, as Brian said, comes down to, what are your needs, what are your primary needs and goals with the program. But yes, thermal imaging can definitely be helpful for different water authorities. Absolutely.
Yeah, and then back to minimum equipment. Also, you definitely want to have extra batteries, spare parts. The props we found, are fortunately the first thing to break if there is something. That happens, but you need to have extra parts on hand to keep things going, so you don't have to wait on the PO and the shipment to come in.
Yeah, we usually recommend at least 3, ideally 4 batteries or sets of batteries per system. That'll keep you operational in the field, being able to cycle those batteries through a multi-cycle charger connected to an inverter in a vehicle, and you can stay out there really as long as you have to. But thankfully, one of the benefits is we can save some time with the aircraft. So that's great. Anything else, Alicia?
Okay, another question. Brian, are your tank inspections sufficient for health department regulations?
I can't answer that. I did that with the engineer, so I would assume that they are, but I can't say for sure.
Great. It was interesting. I was working with some folks not that long ago that had to do some interior tank inspections, and they had actually had some decent success using the Helios by Flyability, the little drone that's basically in a big old little hamster ball and is used for interior ductwork inspections and different types of. I'd seen it before on like tanker inspection, ship tanker inspections internally in the bays, in the holds, and they were actually had just started using it as far as inside water tanks as well. So I imagine if you take a look and do a little online digging, you might be able to find some of those departments that have done that, and they'd be able to give you some feedback on if they are able to get what they need for those purposes as well.
Thanks. So that we'll just wrap things up here. It looks like that was the majority of our questions. So, like I said, you guys will all be getting the recording and the slide deck. So again, if any questions come up as you're reviewing that material, please don't hesitate to call us or email us. We'd be happy to either send additional resources or even just set you up with the correct person on our team.
Yeah, and Alicia, if you want to include my contact information on that, I'd be happy to answer anyone's questions as well.
Great, thanks, Brian. I will definitely do that. So thank you everyone for joining, and a huge thank you to Brian for joining us today. And we hope to speak with you all in the future. Again, let us know if any questions come up. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Thanks, Brian.